In today's episode, we will look at some of the key best practices for assessment and evaluation that we've established from decades of working with health professions programs here at Acuity Insights. Let's talk about holistic success. Hi everyone, I'm Kelly Dore, co-founder and VP of Science and Innovation at Acuity Insights. Welcome to this episode of the Holistic Success Show. Here with me today is Sylvia Mioduszewska, who leads product management for our 145 program management solution here at Acuity Insights. Sylvia works closely with our partner programs to develop 145 further and knows the ins and outs of program management in health sciences, having spent 15 years in medical education. Sylvia, alongside Beth Legacy-Cole, our senior consultant, have recently collaborated to share their expertise on the critical topic of assessment and evaluation in a new best practices guide. They both talk to hundreds of programs over the course of the year, so I'm excited to hear about what they've learned. Today, we're going to dig into and learn more about what prompted them to create this guide, as well as some key takeaways. Sylvia, I'm so excited to chat with you today, as always, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Well, thank you, Kelly. I'm excited to be here. I only wish Beth was here to join us as well, since she was so instrumental in the crafting of this guide. I really learned a lot working alongside her with this one as well. So it's been great.
Absolutely. I'm sure Beth is here with us, not only in spirit, but alongside imprinted all over this guide. I really appreciate you taking the time, and let's jump in and get started to learn about some of the best practices. So, Sylvia, first, what prompted you to create a best practices guide for assessment and evaluation? It's something that, we talk about in health professions education all of the time. So many people are deeply involved at each institution and in each program. Why did we need this guide?
Programs frequently ask us for best practices, which is fantastic. I love that. But when I say us, I mean everyone who's customer facing at Acuity and our program management and data and insights platforms. It was coming up so frequently that we decided it was high time to stop providing ad hoc advice, which of course we'll still continue to do. We're not going to not do that in like all these calls. But we wanted to create a comprehensive guide that can be used by programs, as well as our own internal staff to make sure that programs are achieving the outcomes that they want to achieve over the course of their studies. And we were really careful to ensure that the guide was, software system agnostic, to ensure that whether you use paper, which still happens, or 145 or another system, that you can still have a resource at your fingertips to help you get those program outcomes.
I love that, Sylvia, because I think so many times people are put into a role where they all of a sudden have to be more engaged in assessments and evaluation. Oftentimes we see it as trainees, we see it in the course of our day as faculty or staff members working in a health professions program, but we actually don't know how to build, guide, or do it. Whether that's from program assessments or program evaluations or student assessments, sometimes we're sort of learning as we go, or at our institution, we've always done things the same way. And so maybe can you share with us, after talking to all these programs, looking at, the principles of assessment and evaluation, what are the most common and most problematic issues you see programs struggling with?
I think if you would ask anybody at Acuity or any system in general, they'd all have a different take on it based on their role. But I think the biggest one that I see that's also the sort of easiest one to fix is a lack of consistent and standardized Likharts, which are the biggest culprit of both data issues and potentially even just trainee progression issues. I think there's a couple things that happen. One of those is that there's obvious things, like you have one assessment form that uses a 5-point scale, another has a 7-point scale, and you're really comparing apples to watermelons. They're very different. You can see they're different, right? It's 5 and a 7. Even me with my English degree, I can see that's a different term in terms of math. But I think equally problematic and sometimes harder to spot is when you have those 5-point scales, but the anchors vary enough to not mean the same thing. If I give you an example that actually came across recently in the wild, this actually happened to me recently, where we're assessing learners on a competency-based form, and it was really looking at achieving competencies over time. And it had a 5-point scale, which is typical. And usually on competency-based scales, the 3 is the threshold to be considered like satisfactorily competent, right? 4 and 5 are great. They're really at that point, advanced and exemplary. It's really kind of 3 is that point. But the program was also implementing EPAs, and their faculty were used to using the O score, which is the Ottawa tool for entrustment. And on that 5-point scale, also a 5-point scale, 4 is considered the threshold for consideration for entrustment. So you have faculty who are essentially looking at EPAs and looking, oh, okay, 4 is a pass, which, we like patterns, right? They're getting into that pattern idea. But then they're looking at this other form where it's a 3 now, and like it means different things. And so I think that's kind of the trickiest thing you come across is that standardization and making sure that if it is going to be different, because it's not always going to be perfectly aligned, then you're not mixing those things together. So for example, you wouldn't map them to the exact same framework the same way and look at the data alongside itself, because that would give you misleading information. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the cognitive load too that we're putting on these faculty or residents or other preceptors who are having to flip between not just different types of evaluations that they're doing, maybe different levels of learner, even different types of learners. You start to think about 360s, et cetera. So it can get pretty overwhelming if it's not consistent. And, people don't have a ton of time to often fill these out. And so that additional mental load can actually dramatically impact the quality of the evaluations, maybe even whether or not the evaluations get done.
Absolutely.
So, implementing competency based education, we know that means more assessments, but it's also more complexity for the data and the analysis around these assessments and evaluation. What are some of the critical tips that you have when implementing a competency based framework?
I think we need a whole hour, maybe a whole day to talk about CBE.
At least.
At least. And as you know, I will go on, so I'll try to limit myself here. But I think the most important thing, whether you're assessing competencies or EPAs, I think it really is kind of in your question, like you want to implement a competency-based framework, right? When we say this, it's with understanding that every discipline has a competency framework, and that should be used as the basis for the assessments, all assessments, really. So not only does it help you gain deeper insights into learners and their competence and progression over time and performance, standardizing those forms and using those forms, maybe not so much, but standardizing the frameworks and making sure you're mapping across those frameworks really just makes your discipline stronger. So you're at that point, all the learners across different programs are being assessed similarly, at least. And using that kind of competency framework also supports longitudinal reporting, which is critical to see learner progression over time, which is the actual underpinning of competency-based education. You do want to see that increased competency or entrustment over time, right?
Absolutely. And it's sort of that longitudinal picture that you can get on someone that requires sort of that consistent framework. And that's helpful not only for the individual learners, but the program itself as they maybe make changes to their curriculum or adapt things to understand the impact that has. When you have that consistency of being able to measure those things, it allows you to understand. How can people use this guide, which I was really excited to hear about, when they're looking to improve their practices within their own program, whether that's as, to stimulate conversation or to make change?
Great question, Kelly. And you touched upon it earlier when you're talking about the challenges programs face in terms of what they're able to actually resource in terms of assessment. And not every program has the fortune or funding for an education consultant to help develop a comprehensive suite of programmatic assessment tools, and they're validated and perfect, and they're out there and ready to go. And I think this guide might help those programs who might be struggling and have this work on the shoulders of an already busy program director, for example. But it kind of gives them that ability to pull away at those kind of those big pieces that they may either not be aware of or maybe just don't have time to consider with their busy schedules. But I also think that folks who are well versed in this will find pearls in this guide as well. And I think I mentioned it earlier. I actually learned a lot from Beth along the way. Beth's been doing this for 20 years. I've been in medical education prior to this for 15. And I learn things every day from the awesome people that we work with. And so I think there's value here for everybody on something that they may not have considered or maybe just not seen a certain way. And so I think, even as someone who managed assessment evaluation for a program, I actually learned a fair bit through this as well. Even just the discussion and trying to get on the same page, it was a really great learning experience.
Absolutely. And I think that's, one of the things that maybe we don't think about through is, first of all, your part around, taking bite-sized pieces of this, but also how much there is to learn. This guide almost starts to create a bit of a community of practice around common best practices, what we've learned from multiple programs over time. It's like being able to sit down with your coffee or tea or whatever you need, glass of wine, whatever you're going to use when you read the guide, and thinking about, the many conversations that have informed this guide over time to learn what works and what maybe folks have struggled with.
Absolutely. I also maybe want to add as well, and speaking with my old assessment evaluation manager hat on, I think one issue that I think you touched upon this briefly, but I really kind of want to drive it home a bit, is that we sometimes see folks who are tasked with implementing these assessments, and they're not always the one developing the rubrics and making the actual decisions on what content is on the form. They may not have the positional authority to make changes or make suggestions, or may feel uncomfortable doing so because it comes from somebody who's a leader in their field. And I had programs who struggle with this, and they really would have benefited from having a tool. They go to their leader and say, I'm seeing this in our assessments, but I'm reading this here. Can you help me understand, how to reconcile these things? Like, what am I missing? Is I have a great approach to it, because a lot of times we see things that maybe don't make sense to us, but there could be a lot of things that we don't understand. So it gives, again, as we mentioned before, the idea to have that conversation and discussion and the understanding.
Yeah, I love that. So what's next, Sylvia, is the question, to sort of take this to the next level to help foster and develop those best practices in assessment and evaluation. We have the guide, but what's the next part?
Well, I think we've touched upon it throughout this conversation, but we really are talking a lot more about competency-based education. We're seeing a huge groundswell of support and movement, and in all programs in terms of CBE. And so we want to make sure that we're supporting programs as much as possible in that undertaking. So I'm working on a webinar for, I believe, June. So keep an eye out for that. And I think we'll also be working on a best practices guide for CBE as well, and really kind of diving deep into what you need to consider, whether or not you're assessing EPAs or competencies or both. And we really want to make sure that's really helpful to programs when they start thinking about this, because as you mentioned, it's a huge undertaking. There's more data, more work, more thought going into it, and we want to make sure programs know what they need to know.
I love that, because both assessments and evaluation and obviously competency-based education are overwhelming topics for whether you're talking about somebody who's been in the field for a while or folks who are just taking on a new role, whether that's as a staff or a faculty member, to wrap their head around. So I think these are going to be great key fundamental references and resources for programs and for individuals. Sylvia, thank you so much for sharing your insights and chatting today. It was so much fun. To all of you, thank you for watching and listening. Make sure you go and you download that guide so that you can have a dig into some of the best practices that we've seen through hundreds of conversations with programs. If you haven't already subscribed to our show, please do so, or share this episode with somebody who you think might find it useful or you want to start a conversation with around assessment and evaluation. So with that, we'll catch you in the next episode. If you enjoyed this episode of our show, please be sure to check out the other episodes. And don't forget to subscribe. We have a new episode releasing every week.